50 years. That's how long it took to see again the man who saved me more times than I can count. 50 years wondering if he was still breathing, if he'd aged like me, if he had a family, or if his name ended up etched on a gravestone without my knowing. My name is John Whitmore. I've been a soldier, a brother, a son, a husband, but before all that, I was part of a platoon. And within that tight-knit group of scared young men, there was one who became my anchor. David Thompson. He was more than a comrade in war. He was my lifeline, the one who cracked jokes in the middle of gunfire, who shared the last sip of water, who yanked me by the shoulders when I froze in a minefield. The last time I saw him was in 1973, at a dusty base, surrounded by promises of reunion that time, would swallow. We exchanged a firm handshake, a look that said everything words couldn't, and each went his own way. I came home, got married, had kids, worked, buried friends. And as the years rolled by, the war became memory, became silence, became a yellowed photograph at the bottom of a drawer. But David's face, that never aged inside me. I tried to find him, at different times, with limited means. I wrote to old contacts, searched veteran lists, even asked military associations for help. It always led to a dead end, a disconnected number, a returned letter, a name that appeared nowhere. Part of me thought he'd died and no one had been able to tell me. Part of me prayed, even when I'd forgotten how to pray, that he was out there somewhere, alive, well, even if far away. The years passed like a heavy wind. I watched my wife pass after a long illness, my children grow up and drift into the normal rhythm of life. And there, in the stillness of my 72 years, with the rocking chair creaking louder than my voice, I began to accept that some reunions belong only to youth. Until one day, an ordinary day, with no omens, I opened the mailbox and saw an aged envelope with handwriting that nearly brought me to my knees. John. That's all it said on the front. Inside, a short, yellowed piece of paper with the simplest, most devastating words I could read. I'm still here. David. I stood frozen at the doorstep for long minutes, letter in hand, heart racing as if I were back in the helicopter, waiting for the next landing in enemy territory. But this time, the terrain was different, the past. I sat down slowly, trying to process what it meant. After half a century, he still existed, still remembered, and above all, still reached out to me. I read the letter over 20 times. There was no address, just a phone number with a Tennessee area code. My hands shook as I picked up the phone. Me, who'd crossed jungles, storms, crossfire, now hesitated over a call. I dialed. The voice on the other end was raspier, slower, but it was him. I knew the moment he said my name. There was a silence that seemed to hold all the dust of the years. Neither of us knew what to say, until he let out, with that half-cynical tone he always used to cut through heavy moments. Took you long enough. Huh? Thought you'd gone deaf from the war noise. I laughed. For the first time in months, I laughed with my whole chest, and in that laugh, everything came flooding back. The smell of the field, the whispered talks between tents, the sleepless nights, the trust that saved more than any weapon. We talked for nearly an hour, as if time hadn't passed. He was doing okay, living in a simple house, retired, widowed, too. He said he thought of me whenever he saw one of those old movies that romanticized what we went through. Said he once wrote a piece about me, but never had the guts to publish it. And finally, he said he wanted to see me. We set the reunion for 2 weeks later. I hung up the phone with sweaty hands, my heart restless. I went to the attic and pulled out the old box where I kept everything from the war. Letters, photos, badges, even a torn belt he gave me after a rough mission. I touched the items like they were sacred. Not because I missed the war, but because there, amid the pain and chaos, I found the only true bond that never broke. In the days leading up to the reunion, I relived everything. The departures, the losses, the constant fear of not coming back. And I realized that maybe life was giving me, here at the end of the road, a chance almost no one gets, to look into the eyes of the man who stood by me in the worst, and still remained whole inside me. 2 weeks might seem short, but for someone who waited 50 years, each day weighs like a whole winter. In the mirror, I saw a face time had shaped with patience and harshness. The wrinkles were marked letters, scars, from sleepless nights, unkept promises, names I buried without a place to grieve. But this reunion, as much as it stirred me inside, wasn't driven by nostalgia. It was need. It was the part of my story left hanging, like an unfinished paragraph, waiting for its final sentence. On the morning of the meeting, I wore the jacket from my old uniform. Not out of pride, but because it was the last thing that still physically connected me to the version of myself only he knew. I got in the car and drove to the address David gave me. The road felt longer than it should have. Each mile brought a flicker of memory, a smell, a muffled sound, an expression only those who've lived war understand. When I parked in front of the house, I hesitated. My body knew life doesn't prepare you for reunions like this. Not after so long, not after so many losses. But there he was, standing on the porch, stooped but with that same calm air of someone who watches the world without hurry. And when our eyes met, there were no words, just a step, then another, and then the embrace. We took our time letting go, not because we wanted to dramatize, but because in that silent grip, everything was there. The 50 years that separated us, the dead who didn't return, the letters that never arrived, the children who never met, the tears held back. In that moment, we stopped being two old men revisiting the past. We were two young men alive again, even if just for a brief instant. "You look older than I remembered," he said with a crooked smile. "You're the same, just shrunk about 5 inches." We laughed like two kids who survived the impossible. And I knew, with the deepest certainty, this was the end of a void I'd carried for far too long. We sat on the porch, as if nothing had happened between 1973 and now, as if the dust of the whole world had stopped swirling just so this moment could happen. David served strong coffee, the way we drank it in the early mornings before patrols. Our hands trembled a little, not from age, but from the weight of the reunion. It was strange and familiar at the same time. I looked at him and saw the face I knew in my 20s, hidden by wrinkles and thinning hair. But the eyes were the same, and they carried the same thing I felt in my chest. The sense that we were whole again. We talked for hours, at first, cautiously, about what we'd done with our lives, who stayed, who left. Then with more courage, we dove into the stories time never erased. He reminded me of a night when we were surrounded in a valley, and I insisted on singing a ridiculous song just to keep the others awake. I'd forgotten that. But he remembered details even my memory didn't hold on to. And when he told me that for years, he wrote letters to me and never had the courage to send them, something in me broke and then pieced itself back together. There was a moment when we stopped talking. We just sat there, listening to the sounds of the afternoon. And in that silence, I understood what we were really living. Not a reunion with each other, a reunion with ourselves, with who we were before it all, before the fears, the losses, the guilt we carried for so many years. The next day, We saw each other again, and the day after, and the one after that too. There were no plans, no promises, just a quiet agreement. We'd already lost too much time. Now, every day was gold. We visited the Veterans Memorial together. He showed me photos of soldiers who passed through our hands. I showed him letters I never sent. We pieced our stories together like assembling a map, not to understand where we were, but to finally accept where we'd been. And with each new day, the old friendship stopped, being a frozen memory, and became a new chance to live something real, something that survived war, time, distance, and now was alive again. There was one day in particular in the middle of that improvised routine of reunions that marked me more than all the others. We were walking side by side on a dirt road near his house, slowly, like people with no hurry to get anywhere. David stopped, looked at the horizon, and said, "You know what I thought about most all this time? Not the war. It was how we came out of it without knowing how to live afterward." I stayed silent, because he was right. We survived, yes, but no one taught us what to do with the life that came after. The war ended on the outside, but inside, it lasted much longer. We carried guilt, silences, names we didn't dare say, moments when we asked ourselves why we came back when so many didn't. And now, together again, I realized how much this reunion was more than longing. It was repair. It was healing. Over time, we became part of each other's routines. We had breakfast together a few times a week. He'd call whenever he saw a bad war movie, just to complain and laugh in the end. I helped with small chores. He insisted on paying with cold beer and exaggerated stories. Our children met. My grandkids learned to call him Uncle Dave. And on Sunday afternoons, when the sun sank behind the trees, we'd sit on the porch, without saying a word, just sharing the peace we fought so hard to find. But life, with its sharp punctuality, reminds us that time is always present, never a promise. David started coughing more, sitting less, sleeping earlier. When he said he had a doctor's appointment, I knew it wasn't routine. The tests came back, and with them, the news neither of us wanted to hear. It wasn't serious yet, but it was the kind of thing that settles in slowly, stealing time in silence. He looked me in the eyes the day he got the diagnosis and said, "Stow. Least now you'll stick around until the end, right?" And I answered without hesitation, "This time I'm not letting go of your hand," and I kept my word. In the months that followed, the routine changed, but the bond only grew stronger. I started going to his house every day, at first to distract him, keep him company, listen to those stories he loved to repeat as if they were new, then to care for him, help him stand, make soup, hold his arm on days he faltered. David was always proud, always hated seeming weak, but with me, he didn't need to pretend strength, and that, more than any conversation, said everything. We had a silent agreement, no talk of goodbyes. We never treated it as a farewell, because deep down, we knew the time we still had was too precious to waste on fear, and even when the illness began to limit his movements, he made a point to raise his hand just to touch my shoulder when I walked in, as if saying, "I'm still here." One morning, I brought an old album. Inside, photos of the company, the Platoon, the two of us with faces dirty from war and youth. We flipped through slowly. With each page, he murmured names in a low voice. Sometimes he smiled. Other times, he closed his eyes. When we reached the last photo, a black and white one, him with his arm around me after a tough mission, he placed his hand over the image and said with a hoarse voice, "That back there, that was the start of it all." I just nodded. Because what we started back then, amid the noise of grenades and the uncertainty of each dawn, never ended. It just waited for the right time to complete itself. In his final week, he barely spoke, but his eyes stayed alive. I sat by his bedside, reading excerpts from old letters in a low voice, some he'd written and never sent. One afternoon, while holding his hand, he squeezed my fingers with strength, and with a trembling voice, he said, "Thank you for coming back." I swallowed the tear and whispered, "I never left, Dave. Just took a while to get here." And in that touch, in that silent look, we sealed the most important part of our story. We weren't just survivors. We were brothers until the end. David passed on a cold morning with a clear sky and still air, as if even nature held its breath. I was there by his side. There were no grand words, no ceremony. He just exhaled slowly, holding my hand like someone resting after a long march. His eyes closed without pain, as if he'd simply fallen asleep. And I didn't cry right away, because it wasn't sadness that filled me. It was a kind of completeness, a silence full of meaning. I had come back, and he knew, and that was enough. The funeral was simple, as he wanted. No formalities, no long speeches, just a small group of people who loved him and looked at me with silent respect. No one needed to explain my place there. They knew. Everyone knew. I was the friend he never forgot, the brother in arms, the trench mate, the man who returned when no one expected. After he was gone, the days grew longer. The silence in his house was different now. Not the silence of before, but the silence of final absence. Still, I kept going. Watered the plants, cared for the dog, flipped through the books he left marked. It was as if somehow he was still there, asking me not to disappear again. One afternoon, I sat on the same porch bench where we spent so many hours together, and there, alone, I let the pain come. But with it came a strong memory. The first time he called me back. The letter, the simple signature, the courage to reopen a door the war tried to close. It was in that moment I decided I'd tell our story. Not for others, but for him. For me. Because what we lived wasn't just a reunion, it was redemption. Proof that even after so much time, so much silence, it's still possible to reclaim what's true. It's still possible to keep a promise made amid gunfire and dust. And today, whenever someone asks me if it was hard to find David after 50 years, I answer with the only truth I know. The hard part was living without him all that time. Today, I keep a framed photo on the living room shelf. Inside, an old picture. 2 young men covered in mud, exhausted but alive. Me and David. The photo was taken on the last day of a mission before we parted. Whenever I look at it, I remember what we survived, what we carried, and above all, what we managed to reclaim. Not every reunion needs to be grandiose to be eternal. Ours was quiet, full of pauses, but also full of truth. And it taught me that some promises made in youth, even buried by time, keep pulsing, waiting for the right moment to be fulfilled. David is gone, but he left me with something that doesn't fade. The certainty that real friendship, the kind born in the mud and enduring through years of silence, can cross any distance, even time. And me? I carry on, with the memory alive, with my heart at peace. Because in the end, I came back, and he was there.